For generations now, it feels like Pokemon has missed a lot of different potential type combinations, both in ways that they could have made a fully evolved Pokemon take advantage of a type that has never existed, or even just for ways that it could have made a more broken version of that Pokemon. In today's video, I want to go over 10 different cases where I think that Game Freak actually completely missed the ball on this, and some of these suggestions, of course, came from Twitter. So if you want to be involved in giving some ideas to the next discussion video next week on Wednesday, comment down below. We're going to have a discussion question going up today right alongside this video, and I'll make sure to link it down below. So if you want to get involved in the discussion, of course, comment your thoughts. With that said though, if you do enjoy this, leave a like and subscribe, and if you want to support the channel in any way, shape, or form, join the channel members down below. We currently, of course, have 3 channel members whose names will get shouted out at the end of videos. I know I've been pretty bad about that recently, but I'm going to start doing it again. With that said though, let's go into 10 cases where I think that Game Freak completely missed the ball, and why I think these Pokemon would be at least a little bit better, if not outright viable, or even really good with these type changes. The first one, of course, being Masquerade. Now we all know Masquerade is having Surskit, a water bug type, and it's one of the only ones actually. Until Generation 7, where Araquanid and Dewpider got this typing, this was really the only water bug that we actually had, being Surskit. Whereas Masquerade could have actually been a water bug type that we had significantly earlier. Considering the fact that we already had Pokemon like Butterfree and Beautifly as bug flyings, even stuff like Scyther as far as other bug types to go that are a bit more on the viable end, this Pokemon just wasn't really needed. However, it does give a few things as a bug flying type that are pretty unique compared to others, things like Intimidate for example, as well as the fact that this does have Sticky Webs as of later generations, but I do think that a water bug version of Masquerade could have actually been a bit better. This Pokemon would have been significantly less rock weak, and I think as well the water typing in general just offers more defensively. Instead of stacking another rock weakness, you'd be only 2 times weak to rocks, and you'd become neutral types such as fire, which otherwise do plague the bug typing a little bit. So I think that in this regard, Masquerade could have actually been a very viable Pokemon. This already does actually get a lot of good water type moves, so you wouldn't even need to change the move pool too much, because it gets moves such as Scald and Hydro Pump that could actually be pretty deadly. And with the bug typing, you could even cover potential grasses that would otherwise be very good against water types. So what do you think in this regard? Masquerade was one of the first actually noted cases where a Pokemon had completely been missed the ball, and I think this is personally actually the worst case in the entire video, where a Pokemon truly did just get completely screwed over by a typing, because Masquerade actually had this prior in its evolution, unlike some of the other examples we're going to go over today. Now, this is the only case that I found that was truly this terrible as far as a missed typing goes, but I did want to go over a bunch of others that at least could have added another typing, I guess, to say the least, but we're going to go in generation order based on how, in general, I'm going to go in the order. However, there is one case for Generation 6 Mons where I'll be going over specifically Pokemon that should have been given the Fairy typing that were missed out on. But let's start off with Generation 2, where we do have a few actually really noteworthy examples. For one being Sunflora, a Grass-Fire type Pokemon potentially. Now, this is a type combination that still actually is yet to be shown in any Pokemon game. While it's been leaked for several generations now that we're eventually going to get a Grass-Fire type, I think pretty much I can remember rumors back as early as Gen 7 going on saying that we'd get one, and then rumors came in Gen 8 saying that we'd get one, and now rumors are out saying that we'll get one in Gen 9, and I'll be honest, I don't believe it. I think that Sunflora was probably one of the best chances we had at this type combination, and I think it could have actually been pretty good. Giving Sunflora the ability to hit Pokemon such as different steel types, for example, or opposing grasses could have actually been really nice. And while I understand this would have probably not necessarily saved Sunflora from being bad, considering it still only has base 30 speed, which, to put it in perspective, even if we were to double the speed with Chlorophyll, we're still hitting a Pokemon that can barely outpace base 110s. So this would still have a ways to go as far as being a truly viable Pokemon, but this could have maybe been actually usable in low tiers, whereas now it's completely garbage. There's no real reason to use Sunflora because you're not getting enough out of it with just a pure grass typing. As far as other chlorophyll Pokemon go, even in lower tiers, there's better options, like Victory Bell is typically always in PU anyway, so why bother using Sunflora when it has to compete with other grasses that have better coverage pools? So, in my opinion, while Sunflora would still be a pretty terrible Pokemon regardless, I think this could have at least been something I could have thrown it. Next up though, we do have one of our first suggested ones. Actually, the Masquerade was suggested by Zeke0 on Twitter. This one was suggested by my good pal Nacho. So Nacho had suggested going with a Ghost normal Girafarig, and I actually think this again was another really amazing missed opportunity that we had. Girafarig could have been one of the first noteworthy Ghost normals that we've ever had in the games, and honestly the typing itself speaks perfectly to the capabilities. Ghost normal is a typing that only has one weakness being to dark types, and several other neutralities that it has. Being a Ghost normal type, you actually get 3 immunities, being to Fighting, Normal, and Ghost. So you're already, defensively speaking, handling 2 otherwise potential weaknesses of each type individually, with Ghost now losing its weakness to Ghost because it's immune, and Normal losing its weakness to Fighting because it's immune. Not only this, but Draft bulk for a Pokemon of this typing could actually be pretty not terrible. This already has coverage, there's Shadow Ball, and its special attack isn't even that bad at base 90, to where you could potentially make this again a good BU Pokemon because that typing itself would just be so disgusting. Now, to be fair again, just like with Sunflora, this won't necessarily solve all of Draft issues, but a Ghost normal typing with something like Wish Protect and then Dual Stab could actually be a pretty good option considering there's not a lot of Pokemon that would actually resist the Stab combination. So I do actually think that this is, again, another really big missed opportunity as far as our low-tier Pokemon goes. But as we go through the list today, we'll get into Pokemon that will inherently be more viable in upper tiers. The next one comes from Twitter user who is the Real GK Pure. Sorry, I missed up the Twitter name for a second, but Real GK Pure suggested a Ghost Psychic Chingling in Chemetko, which could actually make a lot of sense. And one thing I will say is while this isn't a unique type combination in itself, it would be unique among non-legendaries, considering right now this is a typing that is exclusively for legendary Pokemon, being Dawnwing's Necrozma, Calyrex Shadow, Lunala, and Hoopa. So this would be the first non-legendary to have this type combination actually, and I think it could actually make a lot of sense. Chimecho could be a Pokemon that's Bell, of course, would be Whispering for the Souls of the Dead, and on top of that as well, you already find it in Mount Pyre anyway, and a Ghost Psychic typing offensively could be really terrifying. Now I will say, I don't think this actually makes Chimecho any bit better. And I think that Chimecho's issues would have been pretty unsolved personally, but as far as a Scarf Pokemon, this could have actually had a lot of potential, being able to handle other Psychic types with the actually really good Ghost Stab. And on top of that as well, there aren't really a ton of low-tier Darks that are truly that viable, but to be fair, this Pokemon in previous generations until like Generation 6, for example, probably wouldn't have had good coverage, considering Dazzling Gleam was the first real coverage I got for Darks. So again, I don't think this makes Chimecho super viable, but it was an opportunity where I do think that, again, Game Freak missed itself on the timeline. Now let's get into Pokemon that start to actually become really big missed opportunities. One of the first ones being in Generation 4, where we miss out on our first chance at an Electric Dark type combination. This is one of those Pokemon I think a lot of people would have really immediately first in their head thought this is a Pokemon that we should have gotten a better typing for. This comes courtesy of Sandy Simmies on Twitter, being the Electric Dark type Luxray. And I think that in general, Electric type actually has gotten missed a lot for potential dual type combinations, with the best case scenario being that it gets them through alternate forms that you otherwise only get on a single Pokemon, and it's a form of that. Such as, for example, with Rotom Heat and Rotom Mow, where these are really cool types with Electric, but it just doesn't get them very widespread. Even as recent as before Generation 8, Rotom Frost's Electric Ice typing was exclusive to that until literally Arctozolt, and I think it's actually just Arctozolt, yeah, that has the type combination. So I do think that in general, Electric has gotten pretty shafted as far as dual types go, and Electric Dark Luxray is no exception. Despite it finally being given to a Pokemon such as Morpeko, I do think that Luxray would have been an amazing candidate in lower tiers. This is a Pokemon you typically find in the NUPU sort of realm, and with an ability like Intimidate while having the Electric Dark typing, this could have been a monster. This already has access to stuff like Guts as well as Intimidate, which are two amazing abilities, and being able to have a more offensively potent typing than just Electric could have been really amazing for it. As far as the moveset goes, it already has access to stuff like Crunch and Throat Chop, which are pretty good, and even without giving it any extra moves, I think that this typing alone could have actually been just really amazing for how many low-tier Psychics there are. And especially just giving another stab to this Pokemon that otherwise has to worry about low-tier grounds giving it issues, when you're able to now handle stuff like Golurk and Palossand with an actually viable stab option. Again, I think this does help a bit as far as making Luxray more viable. As far as our first not PU Pokemon though, we're going to go into Generation 5, where we have a Selgor, which could have been the first and only opportunity we had as a Bug Dark type so far. Now I really tried to fill an option for like a 10th Pokemon on this list, and I think that a Selgor actually fits it perfectly. A Selgor being a ninja could have been a really amazing opportunity to give us a Bug Dark type, and this could have actually had a lot of benefits. For one, the Bug Dark typing would have been one of the ultimate Psychic killers you could think of, considering no matter what the dual typing was of Psychic, unless it's Psychic Steel, or actually even with Psychic Steel's of recent generations, you could have almost certainly had a way to actually hit it super effectively, unless it was like a Psychic Fighting typing, for example, which would be neutral to both. In fact, actually, I can't remember. I'm really bad with type charts, I'm so sorry about that. But in general, a Dark Bug Selgor could have been amazing. Now, to be fair, I do think that a Selgor's move pool currently would need something like a Dark Pulse being added to it to make that viable, but it could still actually be a really amazing option. In general, I think that Dark Bug Selgor could have been one of those really cool Choice Specs users, considering you already do have options for types such as Fighting that would resist otherwise, with moves such as, I believe, well, no, it doesn't get coverage, my bad. I was thinking it got a psychic move, but even still, a Selgor in general could always just run a momentum gaining set with spikes and then dual stabs, and that could be pretty good. However, you could always just go with a physical Selgor and go with like knockoff U-turn, spikes, and some sort of fourth utility move, because this does get a lot of other good options, stuff like Yawn, for example, as well as even just, I don't know, there's a lot of options you get in general utility-wise, though they're a lot more niche, to be fair. Something like an Encore, for example, could be pretty good. But the point being is I think that a Selgor in general could actually be a pretty good opportunity to give us a good Bulk Dark, albeit I don't think it suddenly makes a Selgor an OU Pokemon, but it's a pretty cool typing nonetheless. Next up, I do want to get into something that could have made one of our Weather Setters into an absolute monster, in my personal opinion, being a Fire Fairy type Ninetales. Now, this is the portion of the video I want to personally go over the Fairy typing and why I think this was another missed opportunity on a couple Pokemon that I think could have actually been really terrifying with it. The first one, of course, being a regular Ninetales. Becoming a Fire Fairy typing would have made it a lot more comparable to Alolan Ninetales, which is an Ice Fairy typing, and I think that the Fire Fairy typing in general would be really obnoxious to handle. Being able to have a Fairy type that has a stab combination that handles Steel types for it would be insane. And not only this, but Ninetales already does get coverage through moves such as Extra Sensory for poisons, so this also wouldn't necessarily even be too bad of an issue. Ninetales also having access to stuff like Nasty Plot could help it with more setup variant sets, or you could always run a Choice Spec set or even a more defensive variation that could potentially still benefit from the Fire Fairy typing. I don't think Ninetales would suddenly go to an OU range, but I think there would be a lot more of a reason, at least in singles at the very least, to use this over a Pokemon like, let's say, Torkoal. However, I think that in VGC, Torkoal would still always have the preference, considering the fact that Torkoal has the advantage of being a good Trick Room Weather abuser to give both the fast and slow option to teams. However, I do think as far as a singles perspective goes, Ninetales would be a lot more viable with this, considering one of the typings that roams around constantly in upper tiers would be stuff like Dragons, which you would now actually have a super effective stab to handle them with. So I do think that this would be an amazing benefit for Sun teams, as for both Fires and Grasses, they do have to worry about Dragon types pretty much, like, certainly, so I do think that this would actually be a pretty cool buff. Next up, though, we do have a Dark Fairy Absol, which, while this isn't necessarily a unique typing, this is one of those Pokemon that only got a type added to it in Generation 8, being Grimmsnarl line, and I do think a Dark Fairy Absol could still be really amazing. Similarly to Pokemon such as, for example, with Luxray, this already has Fairy typing in its move pool actually thanks to Play Rough, and I do think that an Absol with this typing could have been at least a viable low-tier Pokemon. This already has priority with things like Sucker Punch, and a 130 attack Absol with Stab, Play Rough, and Dark moves such as Knockoff could have been an absolute menace, considering you're now able to handle stuff such as fighting types, and if you were to focus on a Choice Scarf Absol, for example, you could actually end up outpacing a lot of different fighting type Scarfers in the lower tiers. Pokemon such as Passimian that typically litter in the lower tiers would have no longer been able to necessarily just immediately handle you, especially with your new neutrality to fighting. This would actually be an amazing buff for Absol, and I do think it would make it itself an incredible Pokemon personally. But again, we do have a couple other options that I still think would be more broken. Now the next one I want to go into, of course, is Surfetch, a new Generation 8 Pokemon, and while this isn't a unique typing, it is only on actually one Pokemon right now, being Hawlucha, so I figured the Fighting Flying typing, again, was another missed opportunity here. This would have given, in general, Surfetch just a second really strong stab, especially having the option between stuff like Close Combat and Brave Bird would have been insane for low tiers to handle. In this case, it would less so be about what flying adds to fighting, but more so what the fighting typing could have done for flying, considering that would give this a stab option on a really good breaker that could have handled stuff like rocks and steel types for Surfetch, which, while it already handles those anyway, it would be a flying type that can now handle those, and flying already is an extremely potent offensive typing on Pokemon. As far as moves that this could have run, it already gets stuff like Brave Bird and Dual Wing Beat, so I don't even really see the reason to ignore this, especially considering regular Farfetch was already a dual type with normal flying. So I actually really am confused as to why this one was missed, but this one was again another suggestion thanks to Zeke, as well as the Absol suggestion that was also actually Zeke's as well. But I do have one more Pokemon that I want to get into, which was actually a suggestion by Henry R on Twitter, being the Electric Fighting Zeraora. Now this one is less so because I think it would make Zeraora good, but I think this could have made Zeraora actually almost on par with Magearna and Marshadow. Albeit this certainly would not have made Zeraora Ubers by any means, but I do think a fast fighting electric type would have just been in general a really good Pokemon. And I think you at least could have maybe justified it more being in that trio of mythical Pokemon, even if it is still a good Pokemon in OU, and I don't necessarily think this would make it broken. Now one thing I will say is, is this would actually worsen Zera's Koko matchup, which would be an electric type that Zera it's actually pretty good matchup against, as well as its matchup against a Pokemon like Zapdos, which currently resists both of its dual stabs. However, I do think that despite that, Zeraora with an electric fighting typing would in general just be an obnoxious Pokemon to switch around. Having the dual typing that is already two of the better Pokemon types in general, being electric and fighting, would just give you a really widespread set of stab options, and this already has options such as Aura Sphere in close combat and Focus Blast that it could take advantage of this with its stabs. And it has options like Knockoff, for example, which a lot of good fighting types typically do rely on to handle Psychics. So this basically was given the tools that a fighting type typically had, with a stab that could actually really help against potential flying types that would otherwise try and scarf past you. So while I don't necessarily think that this would suddenly break Zeraora, I just think it was a missed opportunity for an otherwise very unique type combination that we do not currently have. But if you guys have any type combinations that you want to see added to competitive Pokemon, comment them down below. I'd love to see what you guys have. As I said, these were just a few that I think were very missed over the generations, and I would love to see Game Freak retcon one of these even coming in Scarlet and Violet, or at the very least giving a Pokemon that has one of these types shared, because I do think that for everything mentioned here, it's either a type that I would love to see in general added, or a type for a Pokemon that we have so few of that I would still be happy to see another one for. With that said, thank you guys so much for enjoying the video, and shout out to our channel members, being of course Josh aka Ultra Player, Mia, and Zeke Zero. You guys of course carry the channel with support, and I appreciate you guys going above and beyond in order to help out the channel. With that said though, I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, peace out guys.